So Australians are navigating a complex food system every day, and this is in order to optimise their own nutrition, and obviously from that becomes their health. But it is becoming more and more difficult, and research is suggesting that food access around our state is inequitable. The world has a food problem, and I guess we've heard from both John and Charles today talking to these points. The world is able to produce adequate amounts of food for our population, but it's doing so at an expense to our ecosystems with deforestation, land degradation and water losses, and the pollution that's occurring in our environment that is affecting our health. And that's what I'm really going to be talking about today. We've also got to think about that while all of this is happening, we're also getting people who are going hungry, have obesity, and have micronutrient deficiencies. And I'll be talking about these too. We've also got to think about our farmers and how their health is also suffering from the degradation of the land, the droughts that we've seen in New South Wales, that hopefully now we've got some rainfall there, and other things. So we're seeing a higher rate of suicide in our farmers as well. So this is another health issue and a public health issue that we need to think about. Something needs to be done, and soon. So the plan for my talk today, and I've got a couple of talks today, and this is the first one, we're really looking at the nutritional integrity of the food that we eat. And then we're going to look at how this is affecting the chronic diseases that our Australian population tend to have. And this is not just in Australia but globally. And then also the public health impacts of this. So this really is quite a nice little slide that shows three different paradoxes that are sort of on the agenda for today in terms of food and nutrition. The first blue panel talks about the dying of hunger or obesity. Now there's 868 million people who are basically in the world today who are undernourished, and 1.5 billion who are overweight or obese. And 36 million people die from lack of food, whereas 29 million die for overconsumption or obesity. And obviously that's related to other diseases like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease and the like, as well as cancers. We grow quite a lot of food, some millions of tonnes of grains and things, but do we use it to feed people, animals or our cars? And this middle section, the green section of the slide, shows that by 2020 there will be an actual reduction in food supply for humans, a 2% I think it was increase for livestock, and a 15% increase of the grains being grown for use in biofuels. And then down the bottom, and I think both Charles and John has alluded to this, that a third of the food production grown globally is wasted. Now this can be at the agricultural level, it can be at the processing level, we'll talk about the food system in a moment, or it could also be at the household level. So there's some things that you can do as well. But that food that is wasted can actually feed those hungry people, those 868 million hungry people, about 4 times over. Now, oh, hang on. This is a problem because we only have one planet, last time I looked, but it is suggesting by 2050 we're going to be using 3 planets worth of resources. But having just come back from a Cairns and a Public Health Association of Australia meeting last week, there's sort of new information, and there was a lot on climate change at that meeting. And this was a photo that I took of a presentation where they're actually suggesting if we are utilising the resources like they do in the US, we need 5 planets worth, about 4. If we're using the way that we work now, and I think Charles will talk to this about that greed and that overconsumption, we need 4.1 planets if we currently keep the Australian lifestyle going. And they're actually going down. China, 2.2 planets, and India is doing a little bit better at 0.7 of a planet. So all of these things are quite staggering. And this is affecting, obviously, the access to food around the world, and both John and Charles has talked to this, the changing in the environment. There's many people who are undernourished, and there's many people who are overnourished. And the overnourished is relating to obesity and being overweight or obese, but those people can also have reductions in micronutrient intake because they're eating high energy dense foods and not nutrient dense foods. And we'll talk about the nutrition soon, after we talked a little bit more about climate change. And really the climate change is then increasing the problems in this area as well. So this is another sort of a photo from the conference that just tried to capture all of the current sort of producers of greenhouse gases in our environment that we're putting up with all the time. And this is driving our problems with climate change. Oops, sorry. The food and water is impacted by climate change, and there's a Climate and Health Alliance that is addressing this and a discussion paper around this. And one of the points that I did want to make is that the food and water security that's impacted by climate change is cross-cutting, I suppose, in the sense that it affects the actual way the plant grows. It also affects our water source. The integrity of the nutrients in the plant can decline, and those rising greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide emissions, etc., build up of carbon dioxide in the area, can actually change the nutritional integrity of maybe even the proteins in the plant. And the change in rainfall, which we're seeing more extreme events and greater downpours, we're losing our topsoils, as we've talked about, into the system, which is getting lost out to sea. And we're trying to also use inputs like fertilisers, etc., to counter those losses. So the whole system is really quite broken. The land and ocean temperatures, as John pointed out, are changing. So this is again impacting the growth of it's impacting loads of things, especially our fisheries industry as well. So there's a whole story there. And our land temperatures increasing means it's not only difficult for possibly the plants to grow in terms of heat stress, but you've also got to think about the farmers and the labourers operating in higher temperatures. Another point that came out at the conference last week was that there will be a greater number of countries experience more than 35 degrees on average temperatures over the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years. So again, that's an average temperature, which means there's going to be a lot of days in the 40s and 50 degrees, and they're already predicting 50 degrees for some of our national capital cities. And with that change in temperature, for every 1 degree you get reductions in yield of some crops, and again John sort of talked to this. And obviously with the change in temperature in our oceans and our water supplies, we can actually get an increase in proliferation of certain pathogens, as outlined on this slide. I think John and Charles also talked about the salinity issues of the soil, but also by tapping into aquifers, we can increase the amounts of heavy metals that are used for irrigation of our food, and even in the processing and possibly in our drinking water as well. So that's all very problematic. The use of fertilisers and pesticides gets into our food supply system, and that and the ammonium in fertilisers plus other changes can also acidify the soils and the water supply. So all of these things are occurring, which are obviously going to impact our food. Now, some of the work that we've done at Edith Cowan University was looking a couple of years ago at a market basket survey of foods that were commonly eaten by children. So we actually took those foods and analysed them for different heavy metals, and then we modelled the consumption of dietary patterns of children to what those actual intakes of those heavy metals would be. And cadmium, specifically nickel and manganese, were ones that when we modelled them, especially at higher consumptions, and children are tending to eat more food at times, that they actually were 60% of World Health recommendations, sort of upper limits, and exceeded some of the European standards. Now, cadmium is in our food supply, and it has been in the past, being in fertilisers, and I believe it's not in fertilisers anymore, but it's also in our system, our food system, through the pollution that we've had or we're soil has been contaminated in the past. And these are two papers where we actually had urine samples from older women, and we looked at the urine cadmium in their excretion in their urine, which is a reflective of what they've eaten. And in the top one, we actually show that those exposures to low levels of cadmium can influence your bone density and also kidney function. And in the second paper here, we had 1,500 women who had urine samples, and we again looked at their cadmium levels, and these levels were quite low and under limits. However, it still increased if they had the higher their levels of urine excretion of cadmium actually was related to cardiovascular disease and death from cardiovascular disease. Some of the good news, though, is that the Department of Health has recently looked at the chemical residues in a whole range of fruits and vegetables, and this is from surveys that have been conducted sort of over the last 10 years or so. And this has shown that for those different chemicals, of the samples tested, about 90% were compliant. So this is some good news. However, I think we've got to think about that we're washing our foods and fruits and vegetables when we do actually buy them. Now, what we've just talked about is the biophysical and the environmental drivers, and this is sort of a map of the food system. It's quite a complicated map of the food system, but it does sort of include all the things we should be thinking about. However, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of those, but just talked about how the biophysical environmental drivers impact some of our production systems. And now I just want to talk about our food environments and how that affects our health. So this is a much more simple picture of the food system from the John Hopkins Centre, sort of showing that we've got the agricultural food system where food is grown, and this is really what we should be teaching more about for our children. And then we're sort of coming around, and really now I want to talk about this bit down here where it's sort of finally got to the shops in some form. So we've really got to think about the bit in the middle, which is the production, the processing of the food into different food items, and how that again can also influence what we're eating because it's often highly processed. The food environment that's around us is probably looks a lot like this. It's a highly processed food environment. It's accessible, and I think Charles is saying it's cheap and easy to access. Okay, this is just a map here of Hungry Jack's in sort of the metropolitan area, and we know that those food environments around schools and childcare centres are often dense in terms of fast food outlets, which makes it difficult, makes it easy for parents and families to buy types of food, but it makes it difficult to actually access healthy food. And our food system is delivering good food, especially if it's grown well in a regenerative farming type of a way, but it's not necessarily that people are making the right food choices. And some of the food that is grown is highly processed and then is sold through different fast food outlets, grocery stores, etc., highly processed foods. So we're actually reducing our quality of our food and increasing the quantity that we're all eating. Also, this ultra-processed foods are also impacting our health. So we do want to understand what a high-quality diet looks like, and we've done this in terms of our own Australian dietary guidelines, but also the World Health Organisation has sort of an idea of what that should look like. And it means about breastfeeding children from an early age. It also means about having a high plant-based diet of about 400 grams of fruit and vegetables a day. It means reducing your total fat intake and saturated fat intake, and also reducing sugar down to about 5% of energy and reducing sodium or salt in food. Now, our Australian dietary guidelines look like this. Essentially, we should be eating more of the 5 core food groups that are on our food plate, okay? And we've got our use small amounts of oils down at the bottom. The only sometimes or occasional foods are our discretionary foods, which include things like alcohol, sausages, donuts, scones of jam and cream, and a few other, foods that we access regularly, which is unfortunate. But are Australians paying attention? Well, only about 7% of adults eat the required amount of vegetables, and about 15% of children eat the required amount of vegetables each day, and then about 1 in 20 eat the required amount of fruit and vegetables. So really, what the problem is that those only sometimes food, and in small amount foods, we get 30 to 40% of our energy from every day, and it's not from the rest of the plate. So if we eat those food, it dilutes the nutrient content. I'm going to go off my spot, okay? These are energy dense, they're not nutrient dense, okay? So they're giving us energy, but not the nutrition, that goes with it. The easy selection, this is the issue. Individuals can easily get access to lots of these types of foods. You can look at the energy content of those, you can look at the sugar, saturated fat, etc. Okay? And we understand that a high diet of energy-dense, low nutrient foods can lead to obesity, increased risks of cancer, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, etc. So we need to shift behaviour of people, but is it just, we're not blaming people, we need to actually look at the whole system. So the system is big and it's all around us, and even our premiers of this year, our 2018 Eagles premiers, actually are a part, in part, they actually are part of the problem in the sense that they actually advertise, they are sponsored by lots of red foods, okay? We've got red foods, the amber foods and the green foods, and that's a problem too. And a lot of sport has unhealthy sponsors. So we're teaching our children these issues in all sorts of ways. The public health, and this is the Live Lighter campaign, is trying to fight this, so they put out sort of, these types of educational tools to try and encourage people to think about what they're buying. So it's that political act in a way that you're talking about, Charles, but it's also an ethical act of do you really want to feed your child this, and now they're going to have to walk for 4.5 hours to burn it off. We also know that diet is related to 6 of the top 11 risk factors for disease. So our high levels of sodium leads to hypertension, our high levels of fat can lead to increased cholesterol levels, etc. So it's really about changing our human behaviour, but also changing our food system and improving it. We also know that plant-based diets are protective against a whole range of diseases. There's evidence for cardiovascular disease. The World Cancer Research Fund has found, it goes back years now, lots of evidence around plant-based foods protecting from a whole variety of cancers. There's also information around reduction of increased plant-based foods will reduce your all-cause mortality, as well as falling over and improving musculoskeletal health. And then finally, and I'll be talking a bit more about this later on and on Sunday about gut health. So we understand that plant matter or fibres in our diet is needed for our gut health, our microbiome health, and really again these can also impact all of our systems as well as our brain and cognitive health, immunity, etc. And I'll talk more about that later. So what can you do to help the planet? So this is just a few ideas in terms of climate change. Maybe turn the power off occasionally. Try and use new renewable resources rather than fossil fuels, and walk more. Again, if we can actually get in the car less, we'll be producing less greenhouse gas emissions. If we are growing our food, which is a great way to improve your own food security, perhaps try and limit the kinds of chemicals that you use, recycle plastics as well, because we know that probably by 2050 there's going to be more plastics in the ocean than fish. And saving water wherever you can, and also sharing your knowledge with your children. And I'm sure after this, hopefully you might write down on your butcher's paper some more ideas. In terms of food and making our food environment healthier, it might be about growing your own food. If you're growing your own food, also think about blue and purple flowers. Shop with the environment in mind, so again about processed packaging of foods. Read the food labels, shop locally, and improve your own, and you all are, your own agri-literacy, so understanding your environment as well, and where food comes from, and how to share that with your children. Thank you.